Hello, I'm Norman Robinson, and welcome to NOLA Crime Crisis. Week to week, day to day, and even hour to hour, we hear about more crime and chaos on our city streets. According to the Wall Street Journal, New Orleans has the highest homicide rate of any major city so far this year. Their data shows that there are about 41 homicides per 100,000 residents. As of September 18th, homicides are up 44% compared to 2021. And that is an unnerving amount of violence happening in our streets. Joining me now to discuss these numbers and what we can do to quell the numbers are Mr. Jeff Asher of Data Analytics and Captain Mike Glasser, President of the Police Association of New Orleans. Gentlemen, welcome to the NOLA Crime Crisis. Unfortunately, it's a heading that happens to be accurate when we're talking about the violence in our streets. Let's start with you, Mr. Asher. Would you please set the tone for this discussion by giving us the breakdown on your statistics?
Sure. I always get the depressing statistics angle for it. So right now, I think we're at 203 murders, which is the highest number through September, and obviously we have a few days left of September, that we've had in any year since 2003. We're on pace to have, if you exclude the 2 years after Katrina when our population was really low and it played with the rate, we're on pace to have the highest murder rate that we've had any year since 1995 or 1996. We are largely following a national trend. Nationally, murder rose 30% in 2020. It rose about another 6% in 2021. But New Orleans is one of the few cities that is having a really large increase again in 2022. We haven't seen necessarily a huge jump in shootings. There's been a slight increase in shootings, but the percentage of those shootings that are ending in fatalities has increased. So we've reached a point that it's not 1994. It's not the year where New Orleans had arguably the worst murder total and murder rate of any large city that's ever been recorded. But if we've gone back to the 1890s in terms of New Orleans murder rate, and this year will probably be somewhere in the top 10 as far as the worst murder rates that we've ever seen, which is saying something, but also, you mentioned that New Orleans has the highest murder rate in the country, and that's true, but we've also been in the top 5 basically every year of my life. We've been
every year of your life? Almost,
not quite, but every year since, I believe, 1987, we've been in the top 5 nationally for big cities and murder rate. So it's not like New Orleans is going from this place where we did not have a gun violence or murder problem to where we do.
We've always had this.
We've always had the problem, and it's gotten worse over the last 3 years.
And murder notwithstanding, the overall crime issue has unnerved the populace.
Well, certainly, and you see a lot of incidents like carjackings and vehicle burglaries, high-profile auto thefts. I think it's not just the quantity, but it's the high-profileness of a lot of these incidents that have been occurring. Obviously, New Orleans has always had crime. It's something that's also, I think, exacerbated by NOPD's commissioned officers' strength going down, that we have all of these issues with response times. Response times impact people's ability to successfully report crimes. So it's not something where you can just say crime X is up 6% or down 4%. There's a lot that goes into how we're able to measure, what we're able to measure. And I think that anecdotally, people feel that the incidents that affect people's lives are happening more often. And I think that the data tends to back that up as well.
We took our cameras to the street, and the people we talked to generally summed up those same sentiments.
We have had several business owners who have relocated to Jefferson Parish or to the North Shore because their customers just simply don't want to come to Orleans Parish anymore. They're afraid of getting carjacked, parking in the city, or any other potential crime happening while they come to the city for whatever services, whether it be a restaurant or chiropractors, those sorts of things. For sure. I mean, women in particular are afraid to park their car, or they're getting carjacked at a red light, or leaving their office for work they get carjacked. So it's happening in broad daylight. There's really no safe time or place anymore. So businesses are suffering as a result of that and losing clientele. They're being forced to go to neighboring parishes.
Captain Michael Glasser, president of the Police Association of New Orleans, after hearing that, what are you thinking?
Well, it's unfortunately what we've been saying for quite some time. We've seen this trend developing. As police officers in the street, we know how people feel about it. We know what our ability is to respond to the calls for service. We know what our ability is to provide a police presence which deny criminals an opportunity to do those things. And we're watching our ability deteriorate and atrophy over time. And the result is obvious. We've been trying to sound that alarm for quite some time. And hopefully now, I think the City Council has listened to us, and they've brought in some experts which has validated what we've been saying all along. So it's frustrating in one way because we've been saying it, but it's gone unheard. But now at least it is now compelling that they now say the same things we do, and it looks like we're going to be taking some action on it.
So what I'm hearing is that even before they hire these 3 experts to come in, and the experts we're talking about are the 3 former New York Police Department officers that they brought in who are now consultants. One of them was here before, that John Linder was here in the 90s.
Yeah.
I remember John.
Yeah, he was a consultant here. He wasn't the NYPD, but he was a consultant.
He was a consultant.
Right.
And they worked for him.
Correct.
All right. Now, when he came in to make his recommendations in the 90s, things seemed to work out. This time, he brought in some recommendations that you guys had already been telling city officials to implement.
That would be correct. I mean,
that's correct.
It's not really hard to understand what we need and what has to be done. It's not that complicated. It's not easy, but it's not complicated. In order for us to respond when people call for help, we have a primary obligation to respond and respond quickly. We also have an obligation to those officers who are responding when they need help that we can respond and respond quickly. And we can't do that with a completely understaffed force that shrinks, and I'm sure Mr. Asher can bear this out, that we're losing officers from the beginning of the year. I think it works out to 1 officer every 45 hours is what our attrition rate has been so far up to this point. So with that in mind, every other day we're down 1 officer on the average, which means we have a smaller and lesser ability to provide that public safety for the citizens and for ourselves. So we have to fix that. And the only way to fix that is to infuse more people into that process. And if we can't hire enough and train enough, we certainly have to retain what we have and end that attrition.
Mr. Asher, what do you say to the general public who might view your numbers? They look at your numbers, and then they interpret this as a matter of incompetence.
Well, the numbers aren't meant to establish blame or produce accountability for anything like that. The goal is to identify problems and hopefully lead to policy solutions. And I think that you look at the declining number of officers, and it's, again, New Orleans is facing a lot of problems that police departments across the country are facing in terms of high attrition rates and low recruitment numbers. And how do we then develop strategies that basically account for the fact that we need to accept that our reality is not 1,100 officers as it was 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. It's not 1,500 officers as it was right after Katrina. It's 940 officers and falling. And how do we then deliver on all of the things that we asked the police department to do successfully without basically, forcing people to not have any type of response if they've called 911. And so we're not here to say it's anybody's fault or anything like that, or that the people that are generating long response times are not working hard. They're going from call to call. It takes time to deal with calls. How do we develop mechanisms that enable officers to focus on the things that you really want them to focus on, solving murders, responding to violent crime, and things like that? And so I think that you saw what the chief was mentioning yesterday in his press conference about adding civilians, taking account of the fact that we have fewer officers and we're not about to have 200 recruits walk through the door anytime soon.
Yeah, I saw that that news conference where he said he wanted to deploy 75 officers to patrol shifts and add 50 to 75 civilian jobs to address the thinning force. What do you think about that, Captain Glasser?
Well, we have to, we have to infuse personnel into the response times. That's not going to be addressed any other way. We have to put more people on the street answering calls and supporting the officers who are answering calls. They have to come from somewhere. That means they come from somewhere else. Okay, so we're going to have to abbreviate some services. We may even have to eliminate some services that are important, but they're not critical. Mm-hmm. This is critical. And in any situation where you have a problem, you have to triage it and determine what is your most important and primary goal. And then we look at the secondary goal and third and fourth and so forth. So at this point in time, I think it's obvious that we need to have people in the street answering those calls and, again, denying criminals an opportunity to operate by being present and being able to interdict crime before it happens and when it happens. On those occasions when we are unable to prevent it, then we need to address it and try to solve it and prevent the next one. We can only do that by getting people in. Now, civilianizing, I think civilianizing can be very useful, but like everything else, we can't overdo it. And there are reasons for that. Some jobs should and could be civilianized, others not so much, because we are an event-driven economy. Mm-hmm. That means that continuously, as you know, there are events going on, Mardi Gras, Essence, the marathons, Jazz Fest, etc. And when we do that, we draw upon some of these important but not critical positions, detectives and administrative people, to supplement those downtown in the street where we have to put a much bigger presence. If we civilianize those, we don't have that resource anymore. We have everybody on the street that we're going to have, and civilians, when they're hired, can only do the one job that they're hired for. They cannot be transitioned over and say, okay, well, now you're going to be on patrol, now you're going to be working traffic. Now, they just can't do that. So there's a law of diminishing returns on that. In some cases it's necessary, and in some cases we can overdo it and basically put too much reliance on civilianizing. So it has to be done, but it has to be done judiciously.
So if you civilianize the wrong departments in the wrong areas, what's the likelihood of something unforeseen happening?
Well, we're in hurricane season. What happens when we've replaced commissioned officers with civilians who can't do what commissioned officers do? Now what do? We have to rely on, yes, federal partners, state partners, but they have their own problems in their own areas, mm-hmm. and we can't rely on them. We've been relying on them way too long, and it hasn't worked out for us. They participate, they help, no question about it, but it's our responsibility, it's not theirs. And in the end, when it's all said and done, the answer is that we have to retain the people we have, hire and train new people, and retain them. That's what has to be done.
So how do you do that?
Well, there's a number of things that has to be done. First, we identified the things that are causing officers to leave. We did that through exit interviews when officers do leave. The city has done it through their own survey. We certainly have done it with the Police Association, and we talk to people who are willing to talk to us anonymously, of course, but they'll talk to us candidly. And we've determined those things that are driving them off in a priority list. Number one was the Public Integrity Bureau and the disciplinary process. Number two was the promotional process. Number three was the consent decree, and number four was pay.
I would have thought the consent decree would have been higher.
Well, you'd think that, but that's not. That's not exactly what's happened with that. It's a significant part, but it has not been the first or the second priority of officers that are leaving and why they were leaving.
That surprises me. It surprises me because the first two things that you were talking about are easily fixed. The consent decree is not.
Well, and yes, and the reverse of that is this. The consent decree will ultimately self-correct. Eventually, the consent decree will be gone. Now, we're probably 9 years, almost 10 years into a 6-year consent decree, but eventually it will self-correct and be gone. But if we don't fix the other ones, how long will they persist? They're easily fixed, but they don't fix it. And that has been the problem, and that's why we've been sounding that alarm for quite some time, begging them to fix the problems that are driving officers off. They've been not leaving law enforcement, but leaving law enforcement here. And they're leaving it here to take lesser paying jobs in the communities around us, the same places that somebody's citizens and businesses are leaving to, and taking lesser paying jobs, except now those communities are raising their pay. So now they're not going to lesser paying jobs, they're going to higher paying jobs. So now pay becomes an issue as well. So those are the things that have to be addressed. That's one of the reasons why we've asked the consent decree monitors and the judge to get us out of the consent decree, which doesn't seem to be happening as quickly as we would like, but it will self-correct eventually. But the other problems, we can fix those right away, and we haven't. And it's that reluctance that has been very frustrating. We could have civilianized positions 2 years ago. Why didn't we? If it's that easy to do, why haven't we done that? Why did we wait until the attrition was critical and then fix it? Why did we wait till critical mass? We've been saying this for quite some time, and that's the frustrating part.
Well, Mr. Asher, you've been working with some city leaders, specifically the city council. What do they want to know? What do they want to know, and why? And what are they looking to do with the information that you bring them?
Well, I think generally they want to know what everyone else wants to know, which is what are the problems, what are causing the problems, and how can we solve them? And not relying on anecdote and sort of gut feeling, as New Orleans in all facets tends to do, but relying on what does the data say? What can we analyze? How are other cities doing it? Can we tell whether what we're doing is working? And so that's generally our angle. And we're usually looking at the police department, just because 75% of the city's public safety budget is going to the police department.
As it should.
Yeah, and they're the ones that are out on the street and interacting with citizenry in a way that none of the other public safety agencies tend to do. So that is generally what the leadership, I think, is looking for. And we've been working with them since 2018. So a lot of the problems have, 2018, 2019, we hit historic lows in murder. We hit historic lows in gun violence. And really since, mid 2020, we've had a lot of these trends that were getting better for the most part for a couple of years have been reversed. And so it's fun to be able to describe trends when they're getting better, and when we're hitting, maybe 120 murders is still too many murders, but it's better than where we are now. Now we're having to describe the opposite, and generally the analysis on our end becomes less popular as the trend worsens in terms of optimism to negativity.
Back to the 90s when we had this crisis, we had this crime crisis, and I think it was former Chief Richard Pennington and Mayor Mark Morial who brought in John Linder and 2 other people. What was his name? Jack Maple?
Jack Maples.
Jack Maple. What's different this time, Captain Glasser?
Well, there's a lot of things that are different. Really, the only thing that's the same is the consultant, Mr. Linder, is the same, and New Orleans is the same, but the problems that we're facing are not. Back then, we did not have an attrition problem. We didn't have a staffing problem. We had a management problem. The way in which we approach crime did not change as the crime changed. We have to evolve like every other organization has to. You have to look at the trends and see what's necessary to keep up. And we haven't. That's part of the frustrating part here. As we've been saying for years, this trend has been going on. Mr. Asher's been watching it for a long time. And as we sit there and watch the needle move, what do we do differently? I approached the city council back in January, and I said, in 6 months I'll be back, and we'll be down another 100 cops, and we'll be up another 150 murders, and we are. And what did we do differently between January and now? Nothing.
I get the sense you don't think there's a sense of urgency. Well, there has been a sense of urgency.
Apparently there wasn't, because otherwise we would have taken action. But the difference back then is that the problems were different. We had, staffing wasn't an issue. We didn't have the national trends of defunding the police and some of the issues that go along with that. We didn't have a consent decree to deal with. which is labor intensive, and it's very difficult to be labor intensive when you have no labor, okay? And it creates issues. So there was a whole host of different problems that were being solved back then. And then some of those issues have unfortunately translated to later issues. As we address some of the other crime, some of the other things that we didn't address have reared their ugly heads, and this is where we are now. And again, if we don't change how we police, we should not expect it to change. If we don't do something different, what's that expression, you know, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. We have done the same thing over and over again. We are a 1,600 officer department operated by 940 officers and shrinking.
And we sat by it and watched this happen.
And what happens when you do that, and I'm not saying we can't police the city effectively with 940 people, not as good as 1,600 clearly, but if we change how we operate, we can become an efficient 900 officer department as opposed to an inefficient 1,600 officer department being manned by 900. Instead of every single thing we do being understaffed by 40%, maybe we need to staff some things at 80 or 90% and let some of those less critical services be either abbreviated or suspended temporarily until we can achieve the staffing we need. We have to change the way we police. And that's hard to do, but they won't do it. I'm hoping now with these consultants in that they will find a way to do it as we've been asking them to do.
How optimistic are you that things are going to change, that they're going to be turned around to the degree that the public feels comfortable? And that they feel differently than the lady we interviewed at the
I'm going to answer
show.
two questions with that. The question is, can it be changed quickly?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Am I optimistic and am I confident that it can be changed? Yes. Most of the things that are problematic can be changed literally within months. It can be.
Within months.
Now, will it be, is the other question that you ask, is will it change? I can't answer that. That's up to the city council and how aggressive they want to be in implementing these changes. It's up to the police administration, whether they're willing to do what needs to be done and do it. But can it be done? Absolutely. We could see a different police department and a different city in a matter of months if we do these things. The longer we drag and the longer we wait, the worse it gets, and the harder it is, and the longer it'll take to reverse the process. But it can be done.
What are your analytics showing, Mr. Asher?
Well, it's showing that, as Mr. Glasser said, it's similar problems in that we're talking about murder from the 90s, but a very different situation. If you think about it, in the 3 years prior to when Mr. Linder and Mr. Maple were hired in '96, something like 55 NOPD officers had been arrested. They had fired or suspended a large number of the force when Chief Pennington came in. So they were in the process of basically remaking the police force for the first 3 years. He didn't release a crime plan until the end of 2016, or excuse me, the end of 1996. So it's a very different situation in that we've had the consent decree that has sort of changed the culture of the department in theory, as opposed to where he had to do it on the fly in the mid-90s. But we're also fighting the headwinds of nationally, murder is not going down.
Right.
If you chart murder in the 90s in New Orleans compared to cities about our size, we had pretty much the same trend. And so it's hard, I think, to say with data what specifically happened between 1994 and 1999 that led to sort of that historically low murder rate. But then by Katrina, we were back up. So the question is not, can we reduce murder, but how can we do these things sustainably? And so I think that the numbers suggest and the national trends suggest that we're in a period of high gun violence, and there's no reason that we can't reduce it. But without smartly approaching gun violence, looking at both law enforcement and non-law enforcement approaches to reducing gun violence, I don't know how we reach that sort of mid-90s levels. I think it goes beyond how are we deploying officers, how are we, who's responding to calls for service and things like that. I think the problem is bigger and structural now than it was in the 90s.
Yeah, I think society as a whole has changed too. And some of the questions being asked by progressives in particular is that it's not whether we're being too harsh, it's that we are taking the wrong approach in our attempts to arrest crime, for the lack of a better word. I'll give you, for instance, a 16-year-old kid in Jefferson Parish was just sentenced to 55 years in prison for a carjacking, in which no one was hurt. Is that going to be an example for that kid, or is it just going to make things worse?
Well, I don't know the exact circumstance, and that sounds on its face to be somewhat harsh. The question always in dealing with juvenile crime is can they be rehabilitated? Are they incorrigible? Is this just a stopover until they hit adult status and go to Angola, or are they salvageable? And at what point are they no longer salvageable, and what are we doing about it? Incarceration, is punitive, but it's also necessary in some cases to insulate the rest of society from that behavior. Because if you don't do that, then there's nothing to stop them from doing it again and someone else being the next victim. So it has two purposes, but the mere incarceration alone, and I'm not a corrections individual, but to lock someone up and then just expect them to change, it's not going to happen. There are things that we probably need to do different in the correctional system. Perhaps give them an opportunity to learn a skill, a vocation, something they can actually earn a living at when they get out, and then maybe reduce a sentence if they do that, and encourage them to take those training courses and get something, and then give them a job so they can actually make a living, not just throw them out on the street with the same stuff they came in their pockets out of an envelope and give it back to them. So we have to do something different in corrections for that to be effective, but at the same time, not keeping them insulated from the rest of society when their behavior suggests that they're going to keep doing that. I think we're remiss, and that's why we're going to have continuous recidivists and continuous crime. At some point, we have to fix both ends of that.
Yeah, and the numbers, Mr. Asher, show that a lot of this is predominantly juveniles.
Especially vehicle burglaries and carjackings. It's not the majority, but it's a larger share than it used to be. I think from a deterrent standpoint, we know from a lot of research that the certainty of being caught swiftly is the greatest deterrent rather than what the punishment is. So we look at things like what are the clearance rates for vehicle burglaries. It's around 4% this year, 3 to 4%.
Wow, yeah.
Carjackings, it's around 30%. Murders, it's around 35 to 40%. So we're talking about, and this is part of the issue with when you have the main problem you're facing is how are you able to respond to calls for service time after time. It makes it difficult to dedicate the resources to be able to solve a lot of these crimes, which we know would have a higher deterrent value. I will say that I would hope that we don't see any kid that's 16, no matter what terrible decisions they've made, as unchangeable as a lost cause, and that I remember myself at 16, and I know that I've changed quite a bit, and I would assume that we should take it upon ourselves societally to be ensuring that no matter what a kid has done when they're a kid, that they have a chance as an adult to be successful, and may or may not succeed. But I think that it sort of, we're sort of leaving the scope of what law enforcement can do, and we look into what are the societal interventions that might be best suited for this kind of effort.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Thanks to both of you for sharing your insight with us on this critical issue, and maybe we'll have you back again on NOLA Crime Crisis.
I'd be delighted.
All right.
Okay.
We would like to thank you this evening for joining us on NOLA Crime Crisis. We will be back next month with more city leaders, business owners, and other civic leaders looking to make a difference in our city. I'm Norman Robinson, and we'll see you next time on NOLA Crime Crisis.